Recently, I've come to realize that I have, without consciously doing so, been reassessing the way I feel about the watches I own. It's not been an intentional review of my watches, but has rather been something that I've drifted into, slowly but surely over a period of time, probably over the last 4 years or so. For me, it's been a slow, gradual process, and as I say, it hasn't been immediately obvious to me that I've been living through my own personal watch enthusiast renaissance. However, when I pause to reflect and look back at my watch journey and the watches I now own, and also when I consider which of my watches are finding themselves with the greatest wrist time over, say, the last 12 months, not to mention the watches I now covet, there are some clear and obvious themes that emerge. My quiet reassessment seems to have occurred for a variety of reasons. However, probably the main reason for this has been the size of the timepiece on my wrist. I suppose this issue of size has stemmed from my own self-awareness of having a slightly skinny 17 centimeter wrist. It's not a wrist that one would call very skinny, but I believe it is a little on the thinner side, at least for the average male. And to my mind, that reality has its limitations. Yet, in spite of my slightly skinny wrists, many of my watches are on the larger side. As explained in a previous video, my first Bremont, a MB2, was bought as a gift for me, and that is a 43mm diameter case. I subsequently wore it for a long time, for the best part of a decade, and I got used to wearing it and accustomed to wearing a watch of that size. And because many of the subsequent Bremonts that I bought thereafter were equally large watches, and in some cases even larger, I just went with it. It was my normality. That was at least until I began buying watches from other brands besides Bremont, which were physically smaller and thinner. And in truth, it was only after making the purchases that I really noticed the smaller size difference and how it compared, and I found that I rather liked the way my smaller watches looked and how they worked for me. It wasn't a deliberate decision to buy smaller watches, but was rather something that was driven by the appeal of the watches themselves, which initially drew my eye. As I say, the later comparison with the watches I already owned ensued. So, as I acquired new watches and experienced the different variety of shapes and sizes, I became increasingly drawn to and have grown ever more enamored, more generally, by smaller watches, smaller diameter cases, shorter lug-to-lug distances, and also thinner watches. Now, this is all relative, and I think I need to provide some context here. When I say smaller, I'm describing a downshift from 43mm diameter cases and 45mm case sizes towards 40 and smaller, down to 36 and 37mm case diameters. Initially, my appreciation and the shift towards what is considered by many to be the perfect size, namely a 36mm case diameter, was driven initially by my acquisition of my Omega Speedmaster Pro, the Moon watch, which heralded an initial step back down, and later my vintage Rolex Oyster Quartz. But really, my appreciation for smaller sized watches was really underscored by the purchase of my Lange & Sohne Saxonia Thin. I think it was the thinness of this watch, a smidge under 6mm, which suddenly made me look closer at the size of the timepiece and how far I'd come from the Bremont watches I'd acquired over the years. The Saxonia Thin is a far more elegant wear, and as I grew accustomed to this much smaller, lighter, rose gold timepiece, I became increasingly wedded to this sized watch as being more of what I felt like was the right-sized case for my wrist. To be fair, my choice of watch to wear is partly a time and place and a mood decision. However, I suppose I now increasingly feel most comfortable with watches of a diameter between 37 and 40mm. Of course, that's only part of the story and doesn't take into account the lug-to-lug distance nor the watch thickness and design, but that's another story. And so, with this preamble and explainer in mind, and having been intrigued by the now iconic watermelon by Studio Underd0g, a watch and also a micro watch brand I must confess to only having seen online and never in person, I was taken by their latest release, and in particular, the Pink Lemonade. The premise of these watches was interesting to me, not least the size of the watch, which I felt would be in keeping with where I am on my personal watch journey. In my eyes, the Pink Lemonade was the one to have, most representing the Studio Underd0g brand. Studio Underd0g announced that they would be making the watch available to purchase online at lunchtime on the 1st of November. So, having already made my buying decision, I did something that I haven't ever done before. I set an alarm on my phone to notify me a couple of minutes before the release time, so that I could try and make an early purchase and stand a decent chance of early delivery prompt until the reminder interrupted a lunch meeting. I apologized to the person I was with and made my excuses. There wasn't any way around it really, so I explained to my lunch guest that I believed everyone needed a hobby that they were slightly embarrassed about, and that watches were mine. He was very polite and understanding and switched to occupying himself for a few minutes, checking his emails, which gave me a break from our discussion that was long enough for me to excitedly log in online and make my purchase. Fastest fingers first. The buying process happened easily and quickly. I later learned that the launch was a massive success for the Studio Underd0g brand, and it was soon followed up by an email that showed the order numbers that will be fulfilled and delivered first. Approaching 2,500 watches were sold, according to Richard, the brand founder, with mine being one of the first 500 to be shipped in December. This email essentially confirmed that my order would be delivered in December. Hooray! With a bit of luck, I might even receive the watch in time for Christmas, I thought. In the event, it arrived on the 8th of December, and rather than wait until Christmas Day, I couldn't help myself and I decided to get acquainted ASAP. It feels a little bit silly to say and admit it out loud, but I'm almost as excited about this watch purchase as any of the more expensive watch purchases I've made. That's a really good realization for me to have made, and I'm enjoying the initial flush of excitement that comes with owning a new watch and during that early period of time when you begin to get properly acquainted. As I say, one of the things that attracted me to the Pink Lemonade was its size. But how big is it really? For what it's worth, I noted that the website reads it has a 37mm case diameter. However, the booklet that came with the watch refers to 37.5mm. Now, I don't have an accurate measuring tool, and honestly, it doesn't bother me that much to know either way. I just thought I'd mention it for anyone who is very precise when it comes to technical specs. All I can tell you is it feels really good on my wrist. For what it's worth, the dial looks smaller than I'd expected for a watch of this size, perhaps because of the bezel design. The 12mm thickness feels more slender than the specs suggest. It really works for me. I can't help but think of another 12mm thick watch that I own, the Sightwork, which feels significantly more substantial in every way. Of course, their designs are completely different. I really like the tactile domed crystal. There's something visceral about it. The strap is gorgeous and very supple suede that immediately molds to wrist. It's also slender at 18mm, tapering down to 16mm. It's more dainty than many other watches and watch straps that I own, being thinner and more lightweight. It suits the watch perfectly. What I have noticed is that the strap discolors easily and quickly. Over time, this will begin to look grubby. Maybe that's okay, given that it's a field watch. Again, I'm okay with this, but wanted to point it out after owning and wearing the watch for less than a month. But the most obvious and striking thing about the Pink Lemonade is, of course, its dial color, which is a playful, graded color palette that looks like it's capable of lighting up a dark room. I can't be certain, but the pink seems to rise and become more dominant in daylight and fade back down the dial when light is poor. Online, a lot has been made of the dial construction and the fact that there's a layer of glass which has Arabic numerals printed on it, suspended above the unmarked luminescent dial base. Consequently, the numerals appear to float. It's a little novel and different, which is partly what this is all about, but isn't that noticeable, to my eye anyway. The other oft remarked upon design feature for this O2 series of watches are the screws that hold the glass in place. This appears to be a bit of a Marmite feature in that people either seem to love them or hate them. Personally, I happen to like them, but then I don't think they're that noticeable and they add a little something extra rather than detract. Regarding timekeeping, after the first day or so of wearing, I began to suspect my Pink Lemonade was gaining time. I'd noticed that the watch was running fast by a few seconds in the initial 12 hours or so. Having checked this over a 24-hour period, I can confirm it does run fast, not by a lot, but by around 4 seconds a day, which is better than the movement's expectations. The dial loom is a standout feature, and initially is really good when you come from bright daylight into darkness. The dial's really bright and standout, but disappointingly, the loom on the hands isn't great at all. Surprisingly, it neither holds a glow for very long, nor does telling the time remain possible throughout the night. This was my most startling and disheartening discovery. I wore this watch to bed on the first night it arrived, and midway through the night, all I could see was a faint glow of a pale moon. The hands were completely indistinguishable against this backdrop. I couldn't make out the silhouette of the hands, let alone the loom on the hands themselves. This is my experience. Initially, I thought that perhaps this was just my eyesight, but having since shown the watch to friends and asked them to tell the time, they too were unable to see the hands in poor light and couldn't make out the time. The sad reality is that for the Pink Lemonade, the time-telling practicalities in the dark are actually rather poor. And for me, that relegates the Pink Lemonade, given its limited functionality, which, of course, cuts across the hypothetical field watch brief in the first place. I hate to say it, but the dial is a bit of a gimmick. I shared this feedback with Studio Underd0g, and here's our exchange. For what it's worth, I have tried the dial in varying degrees of light and UV exposure. It makes no difference once the initial peacocking of light coming from the hands fades. Now, some of you might say that this is an unfair comparison because I'm comparing the Pink Lemonade to much more expensive watches. Well, I can assure you that my disappointment has nothing to do with price. It's related to the dial with its 7 layers of superluminova, the implication being that luminosity is really good. In fairness, Studio Underd0g don't state how much loom is on the hands, nor do they state whether this groundbreaking technique on the dial is supposed to make the watch more legible. It's just that my expectations were that it did. Am I really that bothered? Well, it's still an £800 purchase. Money like that is not to be sniffed at, and there are many cheaper watches with far better legibility. But yes, I must confess to feeling disappointed. I suppose, having seen all the critics gush about this O2 series, I just hoped the watch would live up to my expectations. Sadly, it doesn't. In final analysis, you can't really take this watch too seriously. I did buy it for a bit of fun after all, but in all honesty, I did expect better.